In the final decades of the 5th century, across the once ordered lands of the Western Roman Empire, the sound of marching legions had long since faded into memory. What remained were empty roads, silent forums, and cities whose walls no longer held back the night. Law, the invisible architecture that had bound distant provinces to a single authority, began to dissolve not with a single proclamation, but with the quiet absence of those who once enforced it. Merchants who had traveled under the protection of imperial decrees now moved in fear. Farmers who had paid taxes to distant officials found no collectors arriving. Judges who had ruled according to codified statutes simply stopped appearing. The collapse of order did not announce itself with banners or decrees. It arrived in the spaces between expected arrivals, in the growing silence where authority had once spoken. For centuries, the Roman system had projected an image of permanence. Across Gaul, Italy, Spain, and North Africa, the same legal formulas governed contracts, inheritance, and punishment. A citizen in a provincial town could expect that a dispute over land would be heard according to the same principles applied in the capital. Aqueducts delivered water, grain fleets crossed the Mediterranean under naval escort, and milestones marked distances that officials measured with precision. Daily life moved to the rhythm of administrative routine. Markets opened at dawn beneath the gaze of magistrates. Soldiers received their pay on appointed days. Even the poorest freeman understood that certain boundaries could not be crossed without consequence. That shared understanding formed the quiet foundation of ordinary existence. Yet the foundations had already begun to shift, long before the final emperors vanished from their thrones. In the 3rd century, the empire had nearly broken under the weight of endless usurpations, plague, and invading armies. Recovery had been costly and incomplete. By the 4th century, the currency had been debased so many times that prices rose beyond the reach of fixed wages. Landowners retreated into fortified estates, collecting their own rents and maintaining private guards. The central treasury struggled to pay the legions that still guarded the frontiers. Officials in distant provinces increasingly acted according to local interest, rather than imperial directive. The system continued to function on the surface, but the connections that once transmitted authority from the center outward grew thinner with each passing decade. Warning signs appeared first as small irregularities that most people dismissed. Tax collectors arrived late, or not at all. Court sessions were postponed without explanation. Roads that had been repaired for generations began to show unrepaired cracks and missing milestones. In some regions, the local garrison received no orders for months. Refugees from the frontiers spoke of settlements abandoned without resistance. Yet within the cities, the old ceremonies continued. Inscriptions still praised the eternal city. Coins still bore the faces of emperors. The appearance of continuity proved more comforting than the growing evidence of absence. Few recognized that the machinery of law depended less on written codes than on the continuous presence of those empowered to apply them. As the 5th century advanced, the pressure intensified from every direction. Germanic groups that had once been settled as federates within imperial territory began to act as independent powers. Their leaders negotiated or simply seized control of entire provinces. Roman commanders, unpaid and isolated, sometimes joined them or carved out their own domains. The imperial court in Ravenna issued decrees that fewer and fewer officials could enforce. Correspondence between the capital and distant governors grew sporadic. In the countryside, banditry increased as the distinction between soldier, deserter, and outlaw blurred. Villages that had once relied on imperial protection now faced choices between submission to new masters or desperate self-defense. The old legal categories no longer matched the reality of power on the ground. Key decisions made in distant halls accelerated the unraveling. Emperors and their advisors continued to treat the empire as a single administrative unit, long after it had ceased to function as one. Resources were diverted to defend Italy, while Gaul and Spain slipped further from central control. Attempts to raise new taxes met with resistance from landowners who no longer believed the state could protect them. Military commands were given to men whose loyalty belonged more to personal ambition or to the groups they commanded than to any abstract idea of Rome. Each compromise, each delayed response, each failure to restore communication between center and periphery widened the gaps through which authority drained away. By the time the last Western emperor was deposed in 476, The act itself was almost ceremonial. The structure he supposedly ruled had already hollowed out. The moment the system began to fail was not marked by a single battle or decree. It revealed itself in the everyday experience of those who suddenly discovered that the rules no longer applied. A creditor who sought to enforce a contract found no magistrate willing or able to hear the case. A traveler who appealed to the protection of Roman citizenship discovered that the phrase no longer carried weight beyond the walls of a few remaining cities. Local strongmen began to issue their own judgments, backed by force rather than statute. The written law remained in the archives, but without officials to interpret and enforce it, the words lost their power. In some regions the transition was gradual, in others it arrived with shocking speed, when the last imperial detachment simply marched away and never returned. Human consequences unfolded in the intimate spaces of ordinary lives. Families that had planned inheritances according to Roman rules found their claims contested by new authorities who recognized different customs. Markets that had depended on standardized weights and measures saw trade shrink to barter among neighbors who trusted one another. Women and children who once moved under the relative safety of public order now faced greater vulnerability as the old protections vanished. Violence that had once been constrained by legal process became a tool of settlement. Fear altered daily routines. People locked doors earlier, traveled in larger groups, and kept weapons closer at hand. The psychological weight of uncertainty proved as destructive as any physical threat. Confidence in a shared future eroded, and with it the habits of cooperation that law had once encouraged. Social breakdown followed the disappearance of reliable authority. In cities, the public baths and forums fell into disrepair as municipal funds dried up. In the countryside, large estates became self-contained worlds, their owners exercising powers once reserved for imperial officials. Small freeholders either sought protection under these new lords or abandoned their land altogether. Literacy, already limited, declined further as the schools that had trained scribes and notaries closed. The transmission of legal knowledge itself began to fracture. What had been a uniform system of rights and obligations fragmented into local practices that varied from valley to valley. The idea that justice could be impersonal and predictable gave way to justice determined by proximity to power. Across the former western provinces, the landscape of power rearranged itself. New kingdoms emerged, ruled by leaders who adopted certain Roman titles and forms while discarding others. In some places, remnants of the old administration survived under new masters, adapting codes to new realities. In others, the rupture was nearly complete. The Mediterranean, once a highway of regulated commerce, became a more dangerous space. Correspondence that had once flowed between distant officials slowed to a trickle. The sense of belonging to a single legal community dissolved. For those who lived through the transition, the change was not always experienced as sudden catastrophe. It was often felt as a gradual narrowing of possibilities, a quiet contraction of the world in which law had once made larger ambitions possible. The long-term historical impact stretched across centuries. The disappearance of a unified legal order in the West created the conditions for the emergence of medieval societies built on personal loyalties, local custom, and the slow reconstruction of authority under new forms. Roman law itself did not vanish entirely. Fragments survived in the East, in the Church, and in the memories of scholars. Yet the living system that had once extended its reach from Britain to the edges of the Sahara ceased to exist as a functioning reality. The vacuum it left shaped the political geography of Europe for generations. New institutions arose to fill the space where imperial administration had stood, but they operated according to different logics and different scales of trust. In the silence that followed the departure of the last effective imperial officials, a different kind of order began to form. It was narrower, more personal, and often more precarious. The memory of a time when law had been written, portable, and theoretically equal for all free persons lingered, as both inspiration and warning. Later generations would look back on the Roman achievement with a mixture of admiration and incomprehension, unable fully to grasp how thoroughly the machinery of order had once penetrated daily life. The collapse revealed how dependent that order had been on continuous human effort, on the daily decisions of countless officials, soldiers, and citizens who chose to uphold it. What disappeared was not merely a set of statutes or a distant court. It was the shared expectation that disputes could be resolved without immediate resort to force, that contracts would be honored across distances, and that authority would answer to something larger than local power. When that expectation dissolved, the world that remained was smaller, more dangerous, and more fragmented. The process had been slow enough that many lived through it without recognizing its full meaning until the old certainties were already gone. By then the roads were quieter, the courts empty, and the idea of a single law binding distant lands had become a story told about the past.